This is episode 35 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Women in Depth. I'm very excited to share today's conversation with you. I had the great privilege and honor of speaking with MeiMei Fox on the topic of depth psychology. As some of you may already know, depth psychology is an area that is near and dear to my heart. My studies in depth psychology transformed my life, my practice, how I experience and view the world, and has truly been a gift to me. It's made me better in my relationships and definitely better as a therapist. MeiMei and I both attended Pacifica Graduate Institute, although we were in different programs and there at different times. And how I actually learned about MeiMei and her work was when, synchronistically, I came across an article that she wrote for the Huffington Post on why psychotherapists, coaches, counselors, and healers of all kinds need depth. This really grabbed my attention because there are so many gifts that depth psychology has to offer, and especially as a therapist, to be able to support my clients in their suffering through a depth psychology lens has been incredibly powerful and rewarding. So when I read MeiMei's article and saw that she had also attended Pacifica, I knew I had to reach out and invite her onto the podcast. Also, the mission of the Women in Depth podcast is to have deeper conversations around the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams, and aspects of life that are unknown, uncomfortable, and unfamiliar. Depth psychology is all about that, and this all, of course, also applies to men, but depth psychology involves looking beneath the surface at what is hidden, what's in the dark, what's unfamiliar and uncomfortable. In this episode, you will hear MeiMei share her insights around what depth psychology is and what it means to look at the world and experience it through the lens of depth psychology. MeiMei will share her story of how she was drawn into this area, how depth psychology differs from other therapeutic approaches, and the connection between depth psychology and the soul's journey. MeiMei is an amazing woman with so many ways that she serves and enriches the world, and I am so excited to share her wisdom with you. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today our guest is MeiMei Fox. MeiMei is a published author, co-author, ghostwriter, and freelance editor of hundreds of nonfiction health, wellness, spirituality, and psychology books, articles, and blogs, including the New York Times bestsellers Bend, Not Break with Ping Fu and Fortytude with Sarah Brokaw. Since July 2016, MeiMei has contributed 5 articles monthly to Forbes as part of the Women at Forbes initiative, where she writes about aligning your career with your life purpose and profiles entrepreneurs and changemakers who can serve as role models to us all. Throughout her 15-plus year writing career, MeiMei has edited books by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Columbia professor Robert Thurman, and was an expedition writer for Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter, Alexandra's expedition, Blue Planet. Her articles have been published in the Huffington Post, Self, Stanford Magazine, Mind Body Green, and numerous other publications. Her latest project is publishing her own blog, Adventures with Twins, whose daily posts includes tips on raising twins, healthy recipes, product reviews, guest posts, and interviews with other parents, along with her own deep reflections on parenting. MeiMei also works as a life coach, assisting clients in realizing their most ambitious dreams. She believes in integrating mind, body, and spirit into a total wellness program based on positive self-esteem and goal setting. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa with honors and distinction from Stanford University, with a BA and MA in psychology. and also holds an MA in counseling psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. She's an Anna Forrest certified yoga instructor, and her loftiest goal is to be a promoter of joy. She sits on the board of Hope Foundation USA, an NGO dedicated to providing shelter, education, healthcare, and job skills training to the street kids of Calcutta, India. She is blissfully married to the love of her life, Kiran, and lives in Honolulu with him and their toddler twins, the Joy Boys. Her mantra is, fear less, love more. Hi, MeiMei, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lourdes. Thank you so much for having me on it. It's an honor.
Oh, thank you. I am just really thrilled that you said yes. I first came across your work when I was reading an article you wrote for the Huffington Post on why psychotherapists, coaches, counselors, and healers of all kinds need depth. And this article really resonated with me for several reasons. One of them being I attended Pacifica also for a year, and it was a very meaningful year for me before transferring to another doctoral program. And also as a therapist and knowing how important and necessary a depth approach is when doing the work we do. And so I just knew I had to reach out to you and see if you would be open to coming onto the podcast.
Well, I think those are great reasons. I was excited to hear that you'd spent some time at Pacifica as well.
So just to start off, MeiMei, I know I read a lot about, the work you do in the world, some of the things that, you have created along with your professional achievements and your interests. Would you be able to share a little bit more with our audience?
About what I do professionally? Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in addition to being a mom, which is something that it takes most of my time and energy, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yes. I have been a professional writer for 15 years, so I would consider that the main focus of my career. I have worked as a ghostwriter, which is kind of unusual. People often ask me, how did you get into ghostwriting? And we can talk more about that if you're interested. But I basically helped a friend who was a doctor write his first book. And we found a publisher, got it published. And the woman who published that book became my mentor, found me a literary agent and said, you can do this for a living. I didn't actually know that was a career at all. I didn't even know it existed before writing that first book. So I've really enjoyed that career because I consider every book that I have worked on to be a mini master's thesis. I learned so much in the process of working with these incredibly wise, talented people who've devoted their entire lives to the subjects of their books. I get to spend a year and a half working with them and really getting to know the subject in depth. So I'm also very picky about the projects I take on because I spend so much time on them. So all of the books that I've worked on, they're nonfiction, and they've all been in that health and wellness, spirituality, and psychology domain. So some of them are self-help books, some of them are memoirs, some of them are spiritual books, but they're all about inspiring people to live their best life. So, that's really has been the primary focus of my career, my bread and butter, as I was saying.
I think that's amazing that you are able to step into the lives of another person for, a year or so, and it actually becomes also part of you. Like it's not just you writing someone else's book or helping them express what they're trying to say. It's also something that becomes very personal for you.
In fact, to such an extent that, it has impacted me physically and psychologically. I mean, when I started this career, I didn't, really have any sense, like I said, of what I was getting into. And I remember talking to a good friend after I'd been doing health and wellness writing for a few years. And he said, wow, you've lost like 15 pounds and you got, and it wasn't like I set out on a diet or something. It was just that doing this work, I became more conscious of what I was eating. And, I started eating more fruits and vegetables and organic foods. And I certainly was introduced to spirituality on a level that I had not ever explored before in my life. Working on Infinite Life, which is a book about Tibetan Buddhism with Robert Thurman, who you mentioned in the introduction. It just kind of started opening my eyes to spirituality in a different way than I had seen it before. I'd grown up going to church on and off with my family as a Protestant. I'm a typical WASP in many ways. And I enjoyed the messages of forgiveness and love that Jesus preached. But I didn't see myself, as a churchgoer or kind of subscribing to organized religion. And working on these books offered me a view of make your own spirituality.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And so it's really, the work has really impacted me. So it's interesting that you picked up on that. That's something that not many people do pick up on. But every book has become, I've integrated it and it's become a part of who I am.
When you were speaking, I was reminded of a quote by Emerson that has always stuck with me. I think I first came across it probably like in 2007 or 8. And it goes something like this, that God enters into every person's life through a private door. And
that is beautiful.
Yeah. And I just really felt like, for me at least, it really resonated with me. And as I listened to the stories of other individuals on their own spiritual journeys, it really seemed to fit, a common experience that many people have. And I also was thinking how this, what you're sharing about how you were led to this work with the ghostwriting, it really is an example of, what we would call in depth psychology of those synchronicities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, encountered that word at Pacifica when I was reading the work of Jung. Yes.
Yeah. And for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with what synchronicities are, could you share a little bit more about, maybe how you've experienced them? And I'll just shut up there.
Sure. Well, I think what we were just speaking of, as you said, is a wonderful example of synchronicities. It's kind of like coincidences, but when you look at coincidences from a depth perspective, you see that there are no coincidences. That kind of everything that happens in your life has come into your life to lead you down a path that you may not even have known existed until you're already on it. And that's exactly how I felt about my career. I just happened into it at this moment when I didn't know what to do with my life. And I was in my mid-20s and, I tried a couple of years as a management consultant in the business world, and I was miserable. I just found it soulless, and I didn't know where to turn. And then this, friend came along and said, well, why don't you write this book with me? And then it turned into this 10-year career.
Yeah.
So I would call that a great example of a synchronicity. I have another great one I love, which is that one of my favorite people at Pacifica was Ed Santana. He's now back there. He's completed his PhD, and he's actually working with the administration, helping to run the school. And he's just a remarkable human being and had come from this professional background as a White House intern and working on a merger with AOL.
Wow.
It was so interesting because he didn't come from any sort of traditional background that you would expect to find in a therapy program. And we just completely clicked and hit it off and found out that we were both going through a divorce, and that was a big part of why we were at Pacifica. And also that we had lived a few blocks from each other in Paris.
Wow.
2002.
Oh my gosh.
And had probably seen each other walking down the street.
Oh my goodness.
And, here we just found this soul connection. So I think that's an example of a synchronicity as well.
So, MeiMei, one of the things, there's so much, but one of the things that was really fascinating to me about your experiences is that, you come from a research psychology background, which you studied at Stanford. Mm-hmm. How were you drawn to explore the area of depth psychology, which, as you've mentioned, is pretty unconventional and non-traditional?
Yes, I think it was quite a shocker to some people in my family when I chose Pacifica. So there's two different answers to that. One is that I myself had been going into a very deep, soulful journey with my divorce. And at the same time, literally within months of my deciding to leave my marriage, I found out that my father had been convicted of a crime and he was going to be put under house arrest and had to quit his career. And it was a very traumatic time for me. So I had always been a very light side dominated person, just meaning that, I'm very joyful, I'm upbeat, I'm happy, I kind of go after my goals and I get what I want. And here I found myself in my early 30s with everything turned upside down. My marriage was a failure. I felt like that was just an indication that I was a failure. And my family was, kind of falling to pieces, my family of origin. And I entered this long, dark night of the soul. And so I was really called to an academic program that wasn't about running numbers and data and studying, what percent of people answer this on this question. That work is so important. I mean, it's really valuable. We need it to understand how people work. But I wanted to know, what's going on with myself, and then to be able to help guide other people through this journey, through the darkness. And what called me specifically to Pacifica is the fact that, and this is another amazing synchronicity, I had always loved Joseph Campbell, the work of Joseph Campbell. So if any of your listeners don't know him, he studied mythology, the power of myth, and how every culture in the world has these same myths, like the Great Flood, and the hero's journey in particular resonated with me. And he has a book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that speaks of this common story of exactly what I was going through, which is basically, you start off thinking you have it all figured out, and then something trips you up, and you go into the darkness. And the journey is about ultimately confronting yourself. He says at the heart of the labyrinth, you meet yourself. And you learn some wisdom, and then you come back into the light and you bring your knowledge and wisdom back to other people. And so I just thought, well, this is me. This is the journey I'm on. And I have a calling and an obligation even to help others on this journey. So Pacifica has Joseph Campbell's library. He donated his library there. He's one of the founders. So it just seems so obvious that that's where I should go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just so happens that he and his wife, Jean Campbell, lived in the apartment underneath my grandparents in Hawaii for many years.
So another synchronicity.
Another synchronicity. Yeah. They actually knew him and thought he was just one of the most wonderful people they'd ever known.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, I remember when I started at Pacifica also, and everyone was there, at least in the depth psychology cohort. It wasn't about the academic degree. There was something deeper.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So what surprised you most about this experience?
That's a wonderful question. I think that academically it was quite rigorous, which I enjoyed. Coming from a very academic background, I loved that. But I loved all of the reading, and the professors were just amazing and had such knowledge of their subject areas. But definitely what surprised me was how much I learned about myself during those 2 years. I think I took my own self-knowledge to a far deeper level, and understanding what I was going through in the context of this universal journey really is what pulled me back out of the darkness more than anything. So I began to see my suffering as something that wasn't individual. It wasn't just about me and something I had done, but rather it was universal. It is the human experience. It is all of our journey. We all will encounter some hardship and suffering as we make our way through life. And rather than seeing it as, I'm a failure, or in other moments to be wallowing in self-pity and say, oh, woe is me, why I didn't deserve this and why have these terrible things happened to me. Instead, I just saw it as, wow, this is the human experience. And I can, in fact, learn from it, grow from it, benefit from it, and wind up a much more compassionate, insightful person. And that was tremendously helpful.
Well, it sounds too that just knowing that you're not the only one who's going through this. You see that with so many when they find out, wow, others are feeling the same way or going through similar things. And I think also another part that you alluded to when you spoke about the hero's journey is there's some comfort, I think, at least, for me, knowing that this is a process. And so when it's a process, I know that there's a beginning, there's an end, there are points in the middle, and it kind of helps to anchor you when you're in the throes of it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yes, that's an excellent point. Yeah. That there is this journey, and that there is sort of eventually going to be some upward momentum back up out of that abyss that you've sunk into.
Yeah. I remember, I think at my first day at Pacifica, I believe it was our program chair who welcomed us. And one of the things he said was the one thing that he could tell us that would happen in this experience was that we would be transformed. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, if what the transformation was, if any, for you.
Yeah, well, that's such a powerful word. And I love it. When you said that, it made me laugh a little bit because it sounds sort of cocky or a little bit presumptive. And yet I think it's absolutely true. I mean, I don't think there was one person in my program who didn't feel transformed at the end of our, 2-3 years together. Well, 2 years of coursework, but 3 years then once we completed our master's thesis. For me, there's no question that it was transformative experience being at Pacifica. And I think it's best represented by my understanding of how the gifts that our suffering have to offer us. So I was transformed by my understanding of the gifts that our suffering has to offer us. I found that I had been fighting against, these tragedies or, these things that weren't going the way I wanted in life. And instead, if I could welcome them, Rumi has this beautiful poem called The Guest House, which you're probably familiar with.
Yeah.
Where he says each human being is a guest house, and anger and joy and sadness will all come, welcome them all, invite them to come sit, eat at your table. And that shift in perspective from, instead of fighting against things that I don't want, to welcome everything and say, this is all part of my journey. This is all part of the human experience. And so instead of fighting it and trying to push it away, which is taking so much of my energy and just making me miserable, frankly, if I can welcome it, then it's not that I'm going to enjoy the suffering. I don't want to go that far. I still, as you said, I want to see it as a process and something I'm eventually going to be, getting to a better place until the next thing comes along. But I know that I can learn from it, and I know that I can grow from it. Then that really changes everything. It has made me an infinitely more peaceful person. I'm just much more at peace with, so this is what life has in store for me now.
Yeah.
And, I think I recognize that I had a professor, Alan Cohen. I don't know if you had him. He teaches courses about Stir, and yeah. I mean, I just loved him.
Me too.
Funny and engaging, right?
Yeah, I loved him too. Yeah.
So he had this great line, and I'll never forget it. He said, "We have less control than we like, but more power than we know."
Wow.
And that just summed it up for me. It was like a light bulb going off. It's like, you're not in control. You're not in control. Life is crazy, and there are all these forces, and so much of it is far, far bigger than you. But you have a great deal of power, and your power comes from how you respond.
That's such a great quote because, you see those two words together, but not in the way you described, right? People think to have power is to have control, and to have control is to have power.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Interesting. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So for our listeners who, are not fully versed in all of the things we are talking about, I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit and go over some basics. How would you describe what it means to have a depth psychological perspective, or what does it mean to look at the world through a depth perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I have the best answer for it.
You don't have to have the best answer.
Because I think it's one that people ask me regularly, especially when I was at Pacifica, depth psychology, what does that mean? To me, it is looking at the world through the lens of the soul and the soul's journey. So it's going deeper than, the surface events and emotions, and saying, what's really driving and motivating us as human beings at the level below our emotions and our thoughts, which are really just more symptoms of what's going on. It's like if you think of the ocean and you see the waves at the surface of the ocean, but what is creating those waves are the tides and the winds that have some earthquake that happened thousands of miles away 3 months ago. That's what's creating the waves. And so that is, for me, what depth psychology is. It's saying, rather than just looking at the surface, what are these waves? And you're depressed, or you're anxious, or you're struggling with, the loss of a job or the end of a relationship. There's something deeper going on, which is, who are you? What do you really want? What is your soul calling to you to do, to be in this world? And it's tapping into that and realizing that once you understand that about yourself and about other people, then it really changes how you go about your life. And I think, one of the examples I'll give is this. So if you were to go to a standard kind of psychology treatment for, let's say, depression, then you might talk about your neurotransmitters, and maybe you would want to go on a medication to help you stabilize your neurotransmitters. And I think that's great. I have no problem with that at all. At the same time, you might talk about let's say I just lost my job and I'm struggling to figure out what I want to do. Okay, so that's all fine and dandy. You can talk about that. You can talk about, kind of your experiences in your childhood. But a depth psychologist is going to push you to a deeper level, which is to say, what would be deeply and profoundly satisfying to you? What are you going to do with this one precious life? And what is the impact that you want to have on the world? And if you come at it from that perspective, then it's going to be, it's a harder conversation, I think.
Oh, definitely.
Challenging, right? Yeah. But ultimately, it gives you this wisdom and this confidence, I think, with which to approach the world, which is, coming from a place of standing on who I am and what I'm all about, and it's very grounding, and it's very confidence inspiring, I think.
Because you're coming from a deep, deep knowing of who you are and what really matters. And I love that you shared that example of how someone might experience a depth approach when working with a therapist who follows that as part of one of their approaches. Because sometimes I get a sense that for those who maybe do not follow a depth perspective, it's that we're just looking at, dreams and synchronicities and, myths and fairy tales. And,
right.
And really what I feel we're doing is, no, we're looking at all the same things you're looking at, but we're also looking at what's beneath the surface. So it's what you mentioned. We're going to look at the neurotransmitters. We're going to look at what are the steps we have to do to get you into a job. How are you going to cope with the day-to-day? But at the same time, asking the deeper, harder questions of, what is this situation, this experience, this struggle here to help you see? How is it leading your soul in a direction to bring you back to who you are? And, it's interesting, even after, working with clients, for several years, I still am surprised at the beauty of how these challenges and struggles that show up in our lives are really almost like redirections. Like, you've gotten off track. Here you go. Here's some help to get you back to who you are, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's very well stated. I think Jung is the one who wrote, that nobody chooses this path. I think that's really interesting too. He said, people don't choose this path of depth psychology. No. Life pushes you onto it, usually through some trauma or hardship.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, it's that reframing of trauma or hardship. And as you said, it's like a refocusing. It is a plunging deeper. It kind of, tears you apart so that you can be torn open and find who is there at the core.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. And so, I think it is very challenging. And I think it's also hard work I really take a deep bow to you for doing that work as a therapist, because I think it's also harder work on the therapist end.
I think that it's important work though. And I feel that, at least for me in my own personal journey, because, one of Jung's quotes is, you can only take your clients as far as you've come yourself. And I think for me, this study, this work in depth psychology, what was kind of disconcerting for me was this realization that, oh my gosh, I have been living my life up to this point, based on the information I had, which I thought was all the information. Right. And then you realize that, oh my goodness, there's this whole other part of me that I didn't even know existed and I haven't included in my decision-making processes or even considered. And I think that's that shock of, wow, who am I? And how do I get back to me? And what does that mean for me to make those changes? Because this process, I think what else is difficult about it is coming home to yourself can often be disruptive to other things that are happening in your life, relationships, your work. And so the person finds themselves at a crossroads where, do I do the hard work of honoring my deepest self, or do I continue on this path of just kind of paying attention to what's on the surface? And that's a difficult shift for everyone, I feel.
I think that's so wonderful that you mentioned that. It's funny because I was just speaking about with one of my coaching clients. She's been really deeply engaged in this work for several years now, and we're really beginning to see that transformation, and it's so beautiful and it's such a joy to witness. I'm sure you feel that way too. I mean, that's right. That's the flip side of it. Harder work is it's so rewarding and it's so amazing to see someone step into their power as, kind of their true self. I think it's so incredibly liberating for them.
Yes.
Yeah, it has been for me too. And yet, as you said, it shakes things up, so she's let go of one of her friendships, one of her best friends, and is now wanting to change careers. And, it's very disruptive. It's like an eruption, from a volcano, kind of shaking everything up.
You used a really good image in your article, and it was the image of the trees, and you talked about the root systems as a metaphor for the whole person. Can you go into that a little bit more for our listeners?
Yeah, that was beautiful. I think that actually came from a Pacifica professor also. Give credit where credit is due. So it's this, I love that metaphor. It's so apropos because we look at a tree and we see this trunk and we see these branches reaching up to the sky. And often I think we think of our journey towards transformation as, growing these branches, and we're reaching out and we're exploring new domains and we're reaching towards the light. But there are just as many roots under the ground as there are branches above ground. So every tree is just as equally weighted underneath the earth. And depth psychology says, hey, we need to look at those roots. We need to look at the root system. We are going to go down underneath into the unconscious and the subconscious mind. You mentioned talking about dreams. I used to talk to my depth psychotherapist about dreams every time I saw her and get some sort of takeaway, some amazing takeaway about, how I was reacting to my life from what was coming up in my dreams. Yeah. So we're going to look at dreams. We're going to look at synchronicities. We're going to look at slips of the tongue, and And we're going to say these are all telling us about that root structure that's underneath the earth that we can't always see so clearly, but we know is there. And we know that is actually providing us with the grounding. That is what's rooting us. That is what is holding us to this earth. And it's just as important as those branches reaching towards the light.
So, MeiMei, this article that you wrote, which was the importance, why it is important for psychotherapists, coaches, counselors, and healers of all kinds to have depth. What compelled you to write this?
Well, it was a conversation with my classmate, Ed Santana. It was having a chat with him. He'd finished up, we did a master's together. He went on to get his PhD, and then after completing his PhD, went back to Pacifica to actually help run it and create some new programs. And he called me up because he wanted to talk to me about why I'd become a coach rather than a therapist. And did I think that my education at Pacifica had value to me as a coach? And I said, are you kidding me? I can't even imagine. My work is on a completely different level because of my Pacifica education. And sure, the only reason I didn't become a therapist, honestly, is because of all the hours that are required to get licensed. And I knew this was only going to be a part-time career for me, so it just didn't feel worthwhile. And I knew that with my degree, I could just go ahead and call myself a coach and start working as a coach immediately. But I don't think of my work as any different from what I would do as a depth psychotherapist. I am a depth psychotherapy trained life coach, and I always say that, and it appears in my bios. And when I talk to people, I always explain what that means because it impacts all of my work with my clients. So that's what inspired me to write that article. Is I said, yeah. You kidding? Would I be the same coach if I hadn't had these 2 years and I hadn't learned about the unconscious, and I wasn't willing to push people to take a deeper look, to, take them on these journeys where we go and meet their childhood self or their wounded self. And I encourage them to take wonder walks where they just head off into the world with no agenda, no phone, no nothing, and just experience the world around them and see what signs they may notice or what symbols, a tree, a bird, and then we talk about it. I wouldn't be doing any of that without my depth psychotherapy training. And so I said, I want to encourage people, even if they're massage therapists, if they're nutritionists, or, I think anyone in the healing profession, anyone who's connecting with another human being and helping to guide them on their journey can benefit from having some depth perspective.
So one of the quotes that you included in your article was one by Joseph Cambray, who was, I don't know if he's still the provost at Pacifica, and this was the quote that you shared. Why is this manifesting for this particular person at just this moment in his or her life? And it's not about blaming the person, but rather engaging with what is going on physically, psychologically, emotionally, and not just for that person, but for the society as a whole and even the environment of our planet. So, I think this quote beautifully captures what you described, MeiMei, in that consulting room or the therapy room, whatever container holds the work that occurs between the healing professional and the client. But I think that this goes much bigger. This is bigger than the individual. And I was wondering if you could speak to how society or the world at large can benefit from this depth perspective.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. We talked in Pacifica about a sort of global depression, or if you look at rates of mental illness and prescription drugs, and then also the opioid addiction, you see societal symptoms of malaise or depression, and you from the depth perspective ask yourself, what's going on here? And at Pacifica, we had an entire course about eco psychology and the idea that we are destroying our planet, and our planet is mourning, and our planet is grieving. We're losing species, we're seeing climate change. So not to get too political here, but that impacts our psychology. That impacts us. And we have so many people in our world who don't even make it out into nature on a regular basis. They live in cities and they're not even out breathing fresh air or seeing the ocean or, making contact with the earth ever, except maybe once a week when they're on vacation. And that impacts us psychologically, so there's a bigger picture here. And I mean, really, with this current election and the political regime, I know so many people who are so distressed about what's going on politically in the U.S. right now with women's rights and gay rights and things that they care passionately about. And I've absolutely seen an increase in depression, anxiety, and even sleeplessness, insomnia, physical symptoms as well. Colds, people are getting sick like crazy. This is the depth perspective, taking a look at societally and, on a larger scale that's way, way beyond us as individuals. The impact that our political climate, that our environment has on us and our psychology. And it's really undeniable. It can sound kind of woo-woo.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you think about it for a moment, then you realize that it's not woo-woo. It's not like some hippie talk. It's very concrete, actually. It's like if you're breathing bad air and you're feeling really stressed out about what's going on with our government, then that's going to impact you.
Yeah. As you were speaking, I was thinking again of that image of the trees and the root system. And that image is also something that you can apply to our planet, to our current challenges in our society. That, we see what's happening on the surface, but there's a root system for that also. And, I had a guest on the podcast a few weeks ago, Dr. Anders Beyer, and he spoke on the shadow of technology and how one of the aspects of this is because people are always plugged in, they've lost their connection with the natural world. And when you're not connected to something, you can't have a relationship with it.
Oh, so true.
Yeah. And that just came to mind when you were sharing, about the planet and people not even going outside, going years and not really spending time in nature unless it's, a weekend vacation or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Meimeis, what would you say are the gifts that depth psychology has to offer the individual and the world?
I think that the gift of depth psychology is, first of all, it is taking you to a deeper level, a level of the soul, a journey inward in which you realize that there is a purpose for everything. And that even the worst things that happen to you, not that you have to be thankful for them, but that there is a gift contained within them. There is a gift, there is a nugget or a pearl, even within the struggles and the suffering and the pain and the hardship that is available to you if you do the work to find it. So it's a beautiful, beautiful spiritual practice of saying, I'm going to look at what's happening to me. It said, that quote from the Pacifica Provost, why is this happening to me right now? And what do I have to learn from it? And seeing what happens as a gift or as a lesson, as an opportunity to understand yourself and the world better, I believe inevitably leads to greater compassion and wisdom. I don't think there's any other outcome that's possible. I truly don't. I think you end up being more connected to yourself, more connected to others, more connected to the planet, and more compassionate when you take a depth perspective.
As I was listening to you, two words came up for me, and along with what you were describing, that this process of beginning to weave depth psychology and the depth concepts into your worldview are responsibility and acceptance. Because I think that in this process of looking at yourself, of why am I here now, and what does this mean, what it does is it goes back to what you shared about that quote from Alan Cohen about you may not have much control or any control, but there is so much power. There's so much energy at your disposal. And if that energy can be directed to acceptance, to responsibility, it's so liberating and freeing.
I love that. That's beautiful. And responsibility is a great word. I'm really glad you brought that up because there is, I think that's part of what makes this work so challenging.
Yeah.
Is that there is a part of you that has to take responsibility. And I see that, even with some of my family members who are really still in a lot of pain around things that have happened to them in their life, for example, a divorce, and just blaming the partner, blaming the partner, like he left me, he did this to me, he was a bad person. And depth psychology forces you to take some responsibility for what happened and say, there were two people in this relationship. What called me to the relationship? What lessons did I have to learn from it? What was my contribution? And that seems really unpleasant, and it seems like something that initially we kind of have a knee-jerk reaction to want to resist. But that's where the acceptance comes in, is because once you take responsibility, then I think, you get this insight into who you are and what's driving you. And that's what enables you to change the patterns, and do things differently the next time and not end up in the same relationship again.
Yeah.
Right? I love that you said that about responsibility. It's like responsibility, acceptance, and then transformation really is inevitable, which is why, that Pacifica professor could say it with such confidence when he welcomed your class.
MeiMei, thank you so much for, sharing your experience, your insights, your wisdom. This has just been an incredible experience for me to have this conversation with you. And I just want to thank you.
Well, I want to thank you. I've absolutely enjoyed it. And it has yet again called me in that Pacifica way to take a deeper look at what's going on for me right now in my life. And I appreciate the opportunity to think more deeply about where my journey has taken me. So thank you.
So thank you very much, MeiMei, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with MeiMei. It's difficult to choose what to highlight as there were so many pearls in this conversation. But one of the things that really stood out for me was how MeiMei saw her own experiences within the stages of the hero's journey. I also loved how MeiMei shared that her synchronicities, or these meaningful coincidences, really helped her to ground and connect the experiences she was having. I also loved that MeiMei described her shift into seeing her own suffering as universal and the gifts that suffering brought to her as meaningful for her own healing and growth. Finally, I love that this conversation highlighted the importance of self-exploration and inner work for everyone, not just therapists, counselors, and coaches. And getting to know yourself deeply doesn't require that you work with a therapist or a coach. Knowing yourself more deeply involves looking beneath the surface to the roots of looking beyond the visible and what we think we see or what we think we know. It involves paying attention to what's not so obvious, opening ourselves up to the realm of the unconscious, of dreams, myths, and symbol, all of which allow us to experience more freedom and possibility. For show notes to today's episode, please visit www.lourdesviato.com/women-in-depth, where you will find links to MeiMei's website and any resources mentioned. And if you are interested in getting to know yourself a bit more deeply, I invite you to visit my website and sign up for the free Life Alignment exercise. This is a simple but powerful exercise designed to get you thinking about what really matters to you and why, and exploring how your life reflects these values. It's a good first step in beginning to get to know yourself more deeply. As always, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.